Hello, everyone. I'm honored to have Rafe Kelly in the Yours Truly virtual studio to practice some conversation craft here with us today. Rafe is no stranger to this corner of the internet, having had conversations and built meaningful relationships with all the intellectual and cultural heavy hitters in this corner. He was invited onto Jordan Peterson's podcast and has had several dialogues with Jonathan Peugeot, John Vervaeke, and Paul Vanderklay. This last year, Rafe has engaged deeper into Paul's corner and ventured into the digital commons of the YouTube estuary culture, as he was invited to be a featured guest and speaker at last summer's Northwest Estuary Conference in Olympia, hosted by Nate Heil of the Grail Country community. Needless to say, Rafe is a known digital and embodied person in these here parts. This is always a temptation to seek conversation with someone connected, someone of status, stature, and knownness. And as I traverse this landscape of clicks, likes, and subscribes, the spirits and gravities push and pull the conscience. I've talked about this generally and more specifically recently in my most recent conversation with Luke Thompson. I've not been perfect at this, but in this journey, podcasting, attention economy, and status hierarchy, I've sought to seek conversation with those above or ahead of me only when it made sense to my genuine curiosities and aspirations. And this is the tension of many that in the corner feel related to something like Jordan Peterson's arc in his work there versus Paul Vanderklay's work with the estuary. In other conversations in this space, likely due to Rafe's influence, a collectively conscious conversation around what it does mean to play in this arena. This has recently emerged for me related to the journey into the digital and conversation space. And this is why it made sense to reach out to Rafe, who founded Evolve, Move, Play, whose website reads, reclaim your nature, rediscover play, transform your life, unlock your potential by reconnecting with your body, building authentic relationships, and rediscovering the wisdom of nature through movement and play. Before we go on, don't forget to like and subscribe to follow along and leave a comment to keep the conversation going. And if you'd like to financially support the channel, consider becoming a channel member. Link in the description. My curiosity has led me to reach out to Rafe to open a dialogue and enter into conversation about how we might take the principles of Evolve, Move, Play and practice them in the digital landscape to help us better understand what it is we're doing here and how we might play in such a way that meaning is not lost in the medium, that the form is not mistaken for the essence of honest play. So sit back, clock in, hit the road, and join Rafe and I today as we practice some conversation craft here on the Yours Truly podcast. So without any further delay, I present to you all Rafe Kelly. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. Rafe, thanks again.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, so I was framing that there's a lot of pieces and a lot of ways I want to try to jump into conversation with you today. But I think, at least for me, what would be helpful, like in the form of a conversation, is I've kind of been able to see and into through YouTube kind of a little bit of the journey that you've been on, say like a religious journey. And I was wondering if you would just kind of outline me for how best that makes sense for you, what your religious journey has been like, and wherever you want to start on that to wherever you want to end.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I suppose we're all, in some sense, living in the bones of Christianity, whether we're living in the living body of Christianity or not. There's still a culture that rests upon the bones without necessarily breathing the spirit into it, maybe is a good way of thinking about it. And so, of course, what religion means and all those things is sort of conditioned on this maybe not fully articulated underlying substance. My father was raised Catholic in the Polish Catholic community, basically. His grandfather had started the Immaculate Heart of Mary Church in Cedar Woolley, Washington, but his father was actually a lapsed Mormon. And then on my mom's side, I think they were Methodists. I'm not really sure. It was kind of like it was very minimal sort of attachment to it. Then both my parents went into counterculture and became sort of new age, spiritual types of people. Uh, my dad traveled in India, and both my parents studied yoga. My mom used to go to Kripalu, and they were both yoga teachers at times. My dad used to have statues of Ganesh around. I think the first sacred literature that was read to me as a child was the Bhagavad Gita. And so I absorbed some of those ideas early in life, the ideas of Khalil Gibran and the Prophet. Um, you know, it's hard to describe it more in depth than that. Starting in my around 8 or 9 years old, I had a mentor who took me to something called the Red Cedar Circle, which was a revival of a Native American religious tradition here in the Pacific Northwest called the Sasiwas tradition. So apparently there was different sort of medicines, I think is kind of the best way to think about them, that were coexisting within this region. So it wasn't like there was a single spiritual practice that everybody was practicing, was my understanding, at least as it was taught to me. But this was one of them. And there was a man named Johnny Moses who was kind of the storyteller who'd been raised to bring this forward. And he had opened up the teaching to non-natives, which was a bit of controversy within the community, but that was his choice. And so a lot of spiritual seekers were coming there to learn from Johnny. But ultimately, I couldn't really invest myself in belief. It was hard to sort of take seriously the idea of these spirit powers and all of the rituals around them as like deeply meaningful. So the world in some sense disenchanted for me when I was about 14 years old. I had an older brother who was very naturally skeptical. When he was like I think he was 5 when he decided that Santa Claus wasn't real, right? Just that kind of kid. And he was very rational and very grounded, and he was very exemplary for me of who I wanted to grow up towards being. And so by my late teens, I became sort of a classic new atheist. Spent a lot of time arguing with people online about I wasn't like super deep in the new atheism movement, but I was definitely along those lines. In the early days of the parkour community, we used to get together with folks, and we had some Christians and argued with them a lot. When I was at community college, running into young earth creationists, and trying to point out the flaws and inconsistencies and incoherencies of that worldview. Spent a lot of time doing that when I was young. But let's see, I'm trying to remember how it all started. I don't remember the exact details, but there was a moment when I don't know where exactly this comes from, but there's this quote, right? That God so loved the world that he sacrificed his only son.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why, it just had a certain emotional pull for me. There was something beautiful about it. And it kind of would just echo in my head at times. And it was pretty surprising to me. I would just sort of like, I picked up that phrase and didn't know that much about it, but there it was. And it was just sort of ringing in my mind. And I had studied a lot of history and noticed that the story that was becoming more and more common, which was that Western culture was uniquely bad and evil and filled with, horrible colonial slave owning, mistreatment of women, misogyny. I was like, that's not the story that I'm reading, right? The history that, as I read, was all of the stuff that the West gets uniquely blamed for is actually universal, right? Slavery everywhere. There's exploitation of women everywhere. There's brutality everywhere. Every ethnicity that's in the position to exploit the next ethnicity does so. So the question was like, well, not why did we colonize? Why did we conquer? Why did we enslave? The question was like, why did we stop? The question was, why did we fight? Why was there fights inside our culture about that, right? This is a sort of jumping ahead in the story, but at one point I read 3 books in quick succession. I read a book called Empire of the Summer Moon, which is about the Comanche tribe. I read another book called Lakota Nation, which is about the Lakota people. Another book called Trail of Tears, which is about the experience of the Cherokee, and specifically when they were kicked off their land.
Mhm.
And the brutality of the Comanche was, extraordinary, and there was reciprocal brutality from whites, or from the Americans. And what was interesting was that the press would come out against the massacres of our army, right? People were shamed for doing stuff that the Comanches would go home and be celebrated for doing.
Mhm.
So yeah, we were brutal. We did terrible things with the Comanches. But there was some aspiration in our culture to something greater. It's like, why? What is that? And then if you look at the Lakota versus the United States, they're very similar. Like the Lakota are an expansionist imperial power. They don't seem to be as like committed to just sheer brutality as the Comanches were. But it's very hard to see them as fundamentally more moral actors than the West. They're basically engaged in the same kind of realpolitik and expansion of powers and, fight for territory and everything else. And then with the Cherokee, what's interesting is the Cherokee really did aspire to integrate into Western society, into American society. They did a really good job. They were they were really, really transforming in the ways that they were sort of being asked to. And Andrew Jackson just kicked them out anyways,
Mm.
which was terrible. But at the same time, there were missionaries who had worked in Cherokee lands who were coming back and advocating before Congress to not remove the Indians, who were fighting, who were sending letters. And again, it's like there was no Mongol missionaries who were going back and telling Genghis not to destroy, the cities of northern China. There's no Roman moral leaders who are, damning what Julius Caesar is doing in Gaul. You know, there's no Aztec leaders who are damning what they're doing to the other tribes. So it's like this was really profound. So and then of course I came across Jordan Peterson's work, and he started articulating for me that if Christianity is the bones of our Father, there might be something really, really valuable there. There might be worth going into the underworld and trying to revive it, trying to unite it. So I was kind of a cultural Christian, and a Christian in the sense of believing in the positive impact of Christianity as an institution for a long time. And encountering John Vervaeke's work and the call to agapic love really transformed me personally and helped me completely reorient my work. But I didn't really sort of take the spiritual aspect of Christianity seriously until last year, when my wife and I broke up, or my wife broke up with me, to be more specific. And in the wake of that, processing some of the emotions that kind of had led to patterns of dysfunction in a relationship, I had this moment where I was just weeping, and I was like, I need to believe. I need to believe that there's a Father in heaven who loves me. And then I had another moment where I walked out to this waterfall, and I basically, felt how intensely I was suffering in the separation of my family, how afraid I was for the impact it was going to have on our children. And I just asked I said, if this is my cross, like I'm choosing to take it up, help me take it up. And I felt my arms went out to my sides. I was sort of crucifixed. I felt not like the pain of an actual nail through my hand, right? But this weird sensation of like tingling, like the ghosts of the nails that were in Christ's hands, like there. And there was this moment of like asking God to come and show me that I was loved, and feeling the presence of Christ, I think, and this sense of this incredibly loving, powerful spiritual presence. But the way that I experienced that was so different than you might expect, right? Like you think this is just comforting, this is wish fulfillment, but it's like, no, you feel racked by it. You feel like you are held in the gaze of a dragon, right? Like you feel like your all the parts of you are getting light to them, and that's scary. It's terrifying.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
not as simple as like, you know, you think it's kind of like your mom picking you up and petting you or something like this. No, it's very, very different. And that the juxtaposition of sort of you expect if you like reach out to God, and then what you actually get, makes it a lot harder to like walk out of it and be like, oh, that was just something internal to my psyche. Right.
Yeah.
It's too bizarre. The experience is too bizarre to walk away from it and just be like, in my rational worldview, I can just slot that in as this thing. And then of course it affords me a profound transformation. Not only that conversion, right? I also did an immense amount of therapy. I did MDMA, which of course is a funny thing. I don't think there's a lot of Christians who are like super excited about psychedelics as a means of connecting to God, but that is what happened with me, as wild as that story might be. And
No,
and it afforded me to be a better man. It afforded me to be a better father, right? On the night that my wife and I got back together, she kind of held my face and she was looking at me, and she's like, she could see that I was different. She saw the boy that she fell in love with 21 years ago again. And she's like, how did this happen? How did you come back to me? Um, that brings up a lot of emotion. So, but I told her, it was like, I mean, Jordan Peterson, he led me down a path of kind of unrelenting willingness to search for truth and to dig into the bones of my father. And then John Vervaeke taught me the centrality of agapic love. And then when I needed to be picked up, Christ was there for me. And because of that, I could show up for my family.
and it all came together in an embodied moment, in a spiritually embodied moment, or several spiritually embodied moments.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it also came together within the relationship of marriage and with your wife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that was where I was when I showed up at Estuary, I think in
Mhm.
June last year. I don't remember when it was, but it was all pretty new. And then in the wake of that, right, the intensity of the crisis has sort of moved away, and we're living through day-to-day life. And so it's like I've converted to being a Christian, but what does that mean? I started going to the Orthodox Church, but I made it about 4 times before wrestling season started, and my kids are now wrestling in tournaments every Sunday, so I haven't been able to go to church regularly. And I've been reading my Bible, and I've never read the Bible front to back, so I'm reading. Just got through the prophetic books, so I've been reading. I'm reading the Psalms now, but the prophetic books were pretty hard, right? They're like it's a very uncomfortable vision of God for
Yep.
someone coming from our current cultural context, and it's hard to integrate it with this idea of the benevolence of God, of God's mercy, of God's lovingness, and and so there was a time when like I felt Christ very much like really close, and I could kind of reach and directly ask him questions, and he could show up for me. And maybe I could do that again, but there's this sense in me of like being very leery about relying on that, right? Like it's something like when you're willing to be in touch with the deepest grief that you experience, then you can go talk to Christ directly. But if you're not ready to wade into the deepest parts of your psyche, it's like, don't. My personal sense, and I don't know if this is spiritual wisdom or foolishness or where it comes from, but this is just what I feel. What I feel is that when I'm not in that place, if I just open myself to the spiritual unthinkingly, I don't know what will show up. It's like only in the place of the deepest grief can I do I feel like I'm very, very sure that it's Christ's voice and not something created by my mind or some other power principality that I invite in by just being too open. And I'm not sure I'm ready to open myself quite enough to let Christ in right now.
Well, it goes back to that part of your story with a refrain of you were like, I don't know where, John 3:16, which was the scripture that you were holding on to as a kid or a teenager.
I was in my 30s, actually. Early
Oh, okay.
30s.
So it was that you came to that. So it was like, and that's, you even use the phrase, I don't know if it's a mistranslation or misquote, but you're like that God sacrificed his own son, which isn't typically the Christian, the kind of normal Christian that God gave his son. Is usually sacrifice really points back to something like the cross, which, in my email to you, I kind of outlined that I've had similar experiences in marriage, similar experiences in my Christian journey related to the nearest point to Christ and like distinguishing between something like fear and being scared, where I was afraid of the truth. Really, I was afraid to trust. I was afraid with fear to trust God. But then when I did, I was still scared of consequences, but the fear went away when I took that, when I acted in that faith. But it's interesting, the things that that form and shape us, like the earlier part of your story, like you have this, you not only culturally, but you have like a Christian heritage in your family, and in our, like you said, when we moved into that materialistic modern mindset, it's like meat sacks floating through space. Like none of that actually means anything. But when you get into this idea of like these biblical, even like the prophets, but even saints and even people, like modern people like Lewis or like Billy Graham or something, like, these people, like they did something that have that, and we kind of look to them and to their personage and to their work and to their, and it informs us and it goes into us. And I just think that it's interesting that there was this thing there continually. And that was, you integrated in that story, like Peterson and Vervaeke's influence. When I found myself in that low place of, even though I was like working at churches, like since I was 16, like I was a youth group kid in the South, like, like just imagine all the stereotypes of the kid that goes to church camp, and like, that's me 100%. Yet there was something that didn't, there was a piece of it, even with being within like the word, the culture, that didn't connect within my faith. And so part of my journey in here is kind of, I guess, a journey into connecting to people's stories that are coming from places kind of like outside of that culture a little bit. And I was having a conversation the other day with someone about something like Peterson's work. A lot of people, young men, are seeming to like scoff at him a little bit, because he's not, like playing the blood sports against the, like all the viral clips that were going on or something like that. And they want to see him do that with some version of Christianity, I think. But for me,
You mean young Christians?
I mean, maybe people on their way to Christianity or their way, or their way in there as we stumble in, the ones that I think are still like, that liked Peterson for his propositions against like new atheism. And then now they're wanting to like see that continue to be like a propositional battle and tyranny. That's like, I guess, another conversation. But
yeah, I'm curious about that. I don't like, I haven't like listened to, I think I listened to 2 Jordan Peterson podcasts last year.
yeah.
It's just a huge
Well,
shift. I sort of like intellectual world is actually the declining influence of Peterson. Um, and I think part of it for me is actually his, even though I would identify more as a conservative, it feels like he's been captured as a conservative pundit, and that he
sure.
does particularly, I don't find that part of him particularly interesting, right? I
Well,
think that
yeah.
he's much more interesting, right? Like when his last conversation with John Vervaeke, that is like, wow, that's extraordinary. When that thing can happen, I'm on fire for it. But you know,
From my opinion and perspective on that is, some people will never get to the meat of him if they don't first meet him in that place that he's in right now.
yeah, I mean, I got turned on to him because of the C16 debate, but it's like where is the, how much of your work kind of like, or how much of your thought do you devote in a specific area? How much of your
Mm.
energy is going? And like personally, I just find where his thought is a lot less interesting than it was in 2016 or 2017 or 2015.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's not really a defense. I just would think that he spent so much time in that space that actually dropping down or entering into the way I see it, like I said, I'm kind of like this born and bred evangelical. Paul Vanderkleck talks about evangelicalism being a marketplace of ideas, of
Mm,
Christian ideas, and he's found that place that he probably didn't know existed or scoffed at for a long time, and now he's talking to people from the Chosen and whatnot, things like that. Okay, well, that would be kind of how I see it, but it's not necessarily interesting intellectually. Um, when you're trying to like map evolutionary biology and psychoanalytic theory into, a psychological play and all these types of things, I could see it. Obviously, I wanted to talk a little bit of story with you too about when you brought up the work of missionaries in the frame of with the Indians and more historic places in Western Europe being a change. And I was gonna give you a little talk story with you a little bit on like how I'm even here was because missionaries. This stuff was happening into like the 50s and 60s, even where during the Korean War, there were the South Korean government was like subsidizing American troops with like prostitution and gambling and alcohol. So there were a lot of half Korean uh, babies that were born, and Korean society didn't want them, and there was a huge problem. And so all these orphanages were overflowing with half Korean children. And a missionary came from one of those orphanages and spoke at a church that my grandparents attended in a town of like 300 in Arkansas, and they adopted my dad.
mm,
And those like on this on one scale of like petitioning the government, but also petitioning the church, um, is really powerful and does real things. And it's this kind of undercurrent to some of the more like higher, even like when we're talking about like cultural forces of kind of waging the culture war and whatnot. Um, but the other pieces that I wanted to point to is just go back to the relationship to suffering and being near to Christ. Um, and that's like an inversion between like the power dynamics of God, but you can see that thread even from like the story of Abraham and Isaac all the way to the cross. Like this idea of when you said when God sacrificed his child, I was curious if you wanted to go back to a second because I've heard the kind of like new atheist argument of calling the gospel a story of cosmic child abuse. Like, how did that dialogue within you whenever you've maybe have had those two sides arguing back and forth in your brain?
it's interesting. So reading the I think it was Ezekiel, there's this moment where God sort of talking to Israel, and he's like, nobody liked you, you were lame, you were, you know, ignored among all the nations, and I made you beautiful, and everyone came to your cities and saw you throughout the world, and then you sinned against me, and now I'm going to take it all away from you. And sounds a lot like an abusive partner, right? Sounds like a bad boyfriend, right? Who's got, um, and so yeah, so I can. There's a couple things there. I think one is, I'm reading the Bible as living literature, which is based off the King James version. So there's always the question of like, how well does it actually capture what's underneath? What is the cultural layer of medieval England or early Renaissance England that is rendered there? But then there's this I've had psychedelic experiences, right? And you have the sense that in some sense you're sort of like, I'm trying to remember which prophet it is who talks about like the seeing the angels and these like burning wheels of eyes coming through, right? And when I
I bet
read that,
you might be John or Ezekiel.
yeah, it's one of the prophetic books, but I was like, oh yeah, sounds exactly like what happened when I was on mushrooms, right? Like oh yeah, I've been to a realm that sounds a lot like that, right? There's like the four-headed angels and all that stuff. It's like, okay, this is what a psychedelic experience can be like. So we can look at it through a few different lenses, right? We could say, oh, these are, when you trip certain chemicals in the brain, this is what a human being produces. Or you could say, hey, this is access to something. But if it is access to something, we can also imagine that it's I don't think any human being can contain the entirety of God. And there's certain relationships that we have to God. And one of them is terror. and and the justice of God is in some sense rightly terrifying, I think. Um, when I so there's I think most people who've been around me throughout my adult life, who've spent a lot of time around me, have noticed that there's something hard edged about me at times, and that I can be a little bit uh, and I'm very assertive. And this, I can come off as a little bit angry. I can come off as a little bit pushy. Um, and for the most part, like it's fine, right? It's sort of within the realm of like personality variation that's not pathological. But for my wife, those elements sort of ramped up to a point where they became pathological, um, to the point where she felt cut down. I'm very judgmental, right? Like I tend to have a very critical mind. If I watch a movie, I'm always thinking about wrong about it, right? I'm running through these kinds of thoughts. And for her, like the sense of my judgment was like really, really overwhelming. And then there were certain ways that I asserted myself in arguments between us that sort of feel like they were eroding her own will and her ability to sort of like get her needs met in the relationship and just to even think her own thoughts, right? Like because it was anytime she disagreed with me about something, the intensity of my intellect and my argumentation was just so overwhelming. It was uncomfortable for her. And that got to a really dark place. And I was sort of wrecking, as she told me her pain in our relationship as we were breaking up. I was prepared enough through everything that I'd done to like try to stand in empathy with her. And so I really wasn't very defensive in the beginning. I mean, I certainly was to some degree, but like whenever she said I was hurt by this, I really tried to hear because I saw the hurt in her and I tried to hear it. But it was hard. It was hard for her to say some of these things to me, that she felt abused. She felt abused in our relationship. And I was like, I don't think I'm an abusive person. I don't think I ever wanted to be an abusive spouse, for sure. And I really wanted not to be. Um, and so I had to go and kind of ask myself, like, how could that have happened? How could I have treated the love of my life, this woman who I love so much, the mother of my children, in such a way that she felt like this, that she felt so scared and so unloved? She really didn't think I loved her. And the only way that I could kind of comprehend it was that um, I'd been given some pretty messed up lessons about love, that I had been manipulated into a sexual relationship when I was 12 years old. And uh, and my maps and models for what love was like were really broken. And as much as I was trying to, a lot, like, in the early days after a breakup, I would say, like, I don't hit, I don't yell, and I don't curse. Right? It's like, I'm not an abusive partner because I don't hit her, I don't yell at her, and I never called her bad names or anything like that. But then I started to notice things like, if we were in an argument, was I kind of like looming up? Was my presence sort of physically asserting itself? And how threatening that is when the person talking to you is a deep voiced 6'2" man who weighs 225 pounds and you're a 5 foot woman. It's like, oh, well, maybe I was more threatening and more angry and more scary than I really could realize. I couldn't empathize with what that felt like for her. And so I started being able to try to build a new map, a map that's not just like, I'm not doing the worst things that were done to me, so therefore I'm okay. But sorry, I'm getting a little lost in the story here. The point is that ultimately, to confront how I failed in my marriage, I had to confront how badly I had been hurt by my experience of sexual abuse. And so I worked with a therapist doing something called internal family systems therapy. And I discovered in myself a sort of a self-protective part that I called Nakub. I saw him as a kind of broken, dark angel that he was a sort of combination of my warrior protective tendency, my intellect, and my anger. And these had kind of melded together in a way to sort of like be very assertive and very rational seeming, in a way that helped me sort of cut the world into digestible pieces. I had this vision where I woke up one night and I'd had this dream where I was looking, I saw myself in a butcher room cutting meat. I was trimming meat, and every piece of meat that fell on the ground, if you looked at it, it was actually a mirror, and the mirror had images of me. And then the dream shifted, and I saw myself, and I saw Beth. That's my wife. And I was projecting from my mind rings of light that were capturing her and forcing her into a box, which was part of a series of boxes. And when I stepped back from those boxes, I then saw that this kind of frame that I was existing within, the same way that I was cutting myself up, and the same way that I was cutting her up to try to contain her, was also the way that I was rejecting the spiritual. Right? It was like God was there in this frame that I wasn't willing to see. And so I woke up and I was like, okay, this is what I've been doing. I've been apprehending this world in this way to make it really digestible, because I'm scared. I'm really scared of the bigger world. And so I went in and I was doing this work to try to help that part of me sort of find a new role within me. Like, why is it protecting me? What is it protecting me from? And I was like, well, if you want me to behave differently, you have to go heal the 6-year-old in you and the 12-year-old in you, because these were the two most traumatic times in my life. And so I did that. I had like basically psychedelic experiences just under IFS therapy, where I was shaking and I was having incredibly intense imagery.
Yep.
I was bawling, and I was doing this 6 days a week.
Ooh.
And then I was doing somatic therapy once a week. And at the end of that, I went and did this MDMA therapy session. So I was told that that about 3% of people who do MDMA therapy experience tremors in their body while they're on MDMA therapy. And my therapist had experienced this, and he was sort of suggesting that I might experience it too. He kind of had an inkling that I was going to experience it. But as it turned out, I was the most violent tremoring that the therapist had ever seen. I basically screamed and shook like for 4 hours. And initially, it was purely affect. There was almost no sort of episodic or semantic content for about an hour. It was literally just like feeling the most intense feelings. They were so intense that I really couldn't have described them in the moment. But looking back, I think that they're essentially rage and shame and disgust and pain and fear. And then later, kind of as it calmed down, I started to be able to remember specific things, and I started to have insights about what the meaning of these things that I had treated as meaningless was for me. Now, when I came out of that experience, I had the sense, what I literally felt like was that the MDMA had sort of opened a channel to Christ to come into me and to show me that I could be loved enough to walk through my own personal hell.
Yes. I mean, there's, I on the, I think it was the estuary talk you gave, and you said that somebody came in during one of those sessions, was like, it smells like an exorcism in here.
Yeah.
But when you say, when Jesus came into me in that space and you're shaking on the ground for 4 hours, it's like, does that not sound like a New Testament story? Like, does that, I mean, and when we try to make this like, well, it's just biological things ticking off in my brain, but like, to me, it just sounds like it doesn't take much for Christ to be able to access that if he wants to by command.
Well,
You know,
it's interesting to me, right? I think I'm on the wilds of this sort of liminal space of Christianity here, but I think of Jonathan Pajot and someone like that would be very, very concerned about this. And I think there's a good reason. Like, I do actually think that you could be colonized by bad powers and principalities. I think that these tools are really valuable and powerful, but they are dangerous. It's not that they're safe, right? I've seen the dangers of them. I think that you're set in your intention. I prayed to Christ before I did this. I had really strong intentions. I prayed during it. And I think that protected me from things. But so the second time that I did it, I basically was visited by a demon that night.
yeah.
Right. So first of all, is it purely biological? So based on the half-life of MDMA, I should have basically not had MDMA in my system to any significant degree by like the end of that day. But I had 4 hours of tremors, then I had 2 hours of soberness, and then I had another hour and a half of tremors. And then I had like probably another hour and a half later, I had 20 more minutes, and then another hour and a half later, I had 20 more minutes. And I woke up the next day and did an hour and a half more tremoring. And then I would tremor lightly while processing emotion for weeks afterwards, maybe months.
Yeah.
And what it felt like, it was more like the chemical sort of opened a capacity within me. And my nervous system was like, oh, I can use that. I can do that. I know now how to do this thing. But yeah, so then the second time I took it, I was in a hotel room after it. I was resting to just like rest up. And basically like I kind of like I woke up in the middle of the night and I went into the kind of state that I would do my internal family systems therapy in. And I was sort of like, is Nakub, this character, is he there in me? And I had this, I started feeling as if my skin was burning. And this thing popped up in me, which I don't actually think was that character. I think it was something that was masking itself as that character. But it started saying like, look, like you thought you got rid of me, but actually you just gave me the levers to do way more stuff to you.
Mm.
And so I was laying in bed and like this laughing demonic presence was running around in me for a while. And I felt like I was on fire. And then, and I just kept faith. I just believed that Christ was protecting me in that moment, and that this thing actually didn't have the power it was claiming over me.
Yeah.
And then it went away. And the next day I was fine. And, you know,
So that doesn't, I think I heard you say it, like even at that conference, that there was something like, my left and right brain, like for me to say I'm a Christian now, like it is hard to square that with a materialistic worldview, like
yeah.
those experiences. I mean, it's just like, but are
Well,
there
so
things
it's not that hard to square it in some sense, right? Like you could just say, we can hand wave it away. We can say, right, it's a construction of my psyche. My psyche's been influenced by a Christian culture, which has a certain image of demons. I've watched this or that movie. I've seen blah, blah, blah. I don't think it's that hard to try to explain it in a materialistic fashion. But the sense, having been through it, is that the materialistic explanation doesn't feel like an explanation. It feels like an explaining away. And leaning into the materialistic explanation doesn't feel like it empowers me to engage in the character transformation that I want. So it's a weird thing, because like I suppose that my left brain would say that to sort of solidify our capacity to engage in like highly rigorous epistemology, we should treat these things very skeptically. But then there's this pragmatic side on the other side that says that part doesn't actually see the whole thing, and the whole thing and the evidence that matters to you is when you treat it like this, you love your wife and your children better.
Yeah, and I think that's where you kind of you mentioned something about like why somebody like Jonathan Bijou might have a critique of something, but like for the person that would want to seek those experiences for the sake of the experience versus allowing the experience to change you in the way that it's maybe designed to, or was it's purposed to, or can be purposed to. I've had similar experiences, not with not drug induced, but by, I would say, something like stress induced. I mean, also related to doing therapy, had things that were able to come up into my consciousness that I understood, like through those processes. And something like trying to withhold the truth on such a deep level, like, I had like sores break out on my hands related to that, and was wasting away physically, and even whenever I would say a simple prayer like, God, what should I do? Whenever my wife and I were broken up and separated, I would literally put my hand over my mouth because the confession would try to come out of me.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like, no, I can't do that. It's too much. It's too much.
Yeah.
And, I would have to put my hand over my mouth, and then I would, and then it wasn't until, I was really just confronted with, this is either it's coming down to basically a choice between heaven and hell, for like the rest of your life. And I think, like that fear of whenever you talked about like facing the consequences for your family, for your inheritance, which is where I would go back to like this Isaac idea, like the inheritance of Abraham, like facing, this is what is at stake. But we actually, to save it somehow, some way, we have to actually be willing to let it go out of our control with the truth, and that to me is when you allow that, you allow the dagger to come down. Whether or not it comes all the way down is to be known, but something happens in that act of faith. If you take the faith to trust, something happens that, as I think you said it at the end of that talk at Northwest Estuary, which was, and I have it here, the relationship between faith and works, and also the work of embedding meaning deep into your mind, body, and soul through years of practice. Oh, wait, here it is. He says, I felt tingling in the back of my hands as I felt the ghost of the nails. Somehow through these experiences, I feel like I discovered that love is the highest principle, and that if you put your faith in God that loves you, you can work a miracle.
Yeah.
And
For
so, I mean,
me,
yeah, I think it's a miracle. I think what you talk about is a miracle. I think what I experienced was something like a miracle.
absolutely. I mean, I could not have saved my family without faith.
Mhm.
And it doesn't violate the laws of physics, but uh, it means everything to me
Mm.
and to my wife and to my children, right?
Yep.
And the work of it is just continuing to sort of propagates through the life, right? Like as my wife and I have healed our marriage, we've watched as our children have just become more confident and happier and more loving and open and capable, and just it's like you know I'd like to think we were always doing a pretty good job as parents, but they feel it. They feel the dysfunction in your marriage, and it's insecure for them, and it comes out sideways in various ways. My son is turning into a very interesting character. He he went through a phase where he was like almost impossible to talk to because he would just deflect every question and like go into the weirdest little existential sort of everything he said was obfuscatory, right? And he was like inventing his own language, and he would only respond in his own language to questions. Like we had to like push him to speak English. And he was really like suffering as far as like being able to, he was having tons of anxiety at school, and breaking into tears and all these things. Um, and it only became clear in retrospect how much that was really like him feeling insecure with us and, in my relationship to him. And as he's sort of, uh, as he's become increasingly secure, that he starts to actually reveal what's in his mind with clarity. And then you start to see, wow, this kid's like very, very thoughtful, like really, really thinking deeply about stuff. We had this crazy conversation about the nature of time and
Mm.
rhythms and music. And it was like, I'm like, wow, this kid is thinking on a whole different level, right? And so it's like there was a way in which my son had hidden himself from me. He had created this this persona in some sense that was self-protective, and he was actually experiencing derealization. He was like talking to his mom a lot about like how he didn't feel like he was real, or things were real, and all that's like going away. And
Mhm.
we started. He's been doing martial arts with me since he was 4 years old, and he was doing parkour with me. And he's like, last summer before last, we went to Europe, and we produced some videos of him like moving in the trees, and he's getting like millions of views on
Mm.
his because he's so extraordinary for his age. And for various reasons, I wanted to pull back on that because I didn't want to kind of fall into the trap of wanting to farm my kid for content. But there was a point at which he started telling me he didn't like parkour anymore, and he didn't like this, and he quit martial arts. So it took 18 months off martial arts. So now he's now on the ninja team here in town. So he's doing that, and he's absolutely loving it. He's excelling. And we went back and we did American folk style wrestling, and this is the first time he'd actually competed in martial arts. And so um, he just finished novice state last weekend. And he finished second in state,
Cool.
and he was only beaten twice his whole novice season. They were both by the same boy. So
Mm.
it was his second match that he lost to this boy Victor, and he just did his the state championships. His first match was against this boy, and the first time they matched up, he was just completely overmatched, and he was on defense the whole time, and he fought valiantly, but he had no chance. This time, he actually almost pinned the kid, and was very, very close to winning. He was, on offense for a lot of it. And it was just to see that in 3 months, that growth, but to see the way that it secured him and made him feel more grounded and alive, and like he's just so much happier.
Mm.
And it's like the wrestling's been really good for him, but the wrestling wouldn't be good for him if he didn't feel like I was supporting him and that he was going to be seen and loved and held. And if he didn't feel like his parents loved each other, right? Like all starts, like I really, like I've really come to the belief that like on some fundamental level, the most important thing is for men and women to love each other, like to bond truly and to really love each other. And if there's the foundation of the deepest marital love, that's like it's the acorn from which the tree of life grows.
Yeah.
And if we get that wrong, it's like it doesn't grow right.
I mean, there's a lot there, because to think back to your story, even in the part where you mentioned, and I'd heard this on your conversation with John Vervaeke about the abuse, but like it seemed like there was the move from that to try. I mean, I don't want to say what happened, but something like to control. And, even like with your life's work of like evolve, move, play, which I think this is a really good segue, talking about your son, talking about the digital nature of like the viral videos, but also like what's underneath it. Like it's not, it isn't enough actually to hold the meaning, like the goodness that is, in and of itself has to be set on top. Like the goodness of your son's play, like it is good that you were wrestling with your son at 4 and doing all these things, but it was almost like in and of itself, it wasn't at the time, maybe, or as it continued to erode as the stories go, I mean, I believe that for myself, like the experience that we had in our marriage, my oldest is 15 now, but she was 6, and then my wife was pregnant, and we had a 4-year or 3-year-old. And they're also, I can say, in the similar way of just like their confidence in their life, like a big goal is that that home is your safest, strongest, most secure reality. And it's interesting you used even in like your son, like kind of this, what's real, so much there. But I do want to talk to you and move into this conversation about like your life's work related to play, in this, because something that's been interesting to me, in this kind of corner, there's like several channels, like, Nate's channel, The Grail Country, and other people. And there's other people in this space, Grim and Chad, and a lot of others, kind of down from Paul Vanderklay. He lets everyone play with him on his, channel and stuff. And like, yeah, like where are you seeing that the spirit of play, like get technical with how, maybe what is a healthy way, or I don't know if that's the best word, but like a proper way that we would play on the internet in this kind of medium? Because you look over and you're looking at subs and you're looking at watch statistics, but you're also like, I like this guy and he's my friend, but there's like this friendly thing. But then there's also like, oh, who is this person talking to? And like all that's just real and it's all happening.
Yeah.
How would you frame that with play?
Some of those dynamics happen in life too, right? Like you
Yeah.
have frenemies in real life, and you get jealous about the relationships, and you worry about your status, and we've kind of amplified those dynamics. It's like, if I, so like, let's say I'm, on the outskirts of the Jordan Peterson sort of network, right? And of course, if I was sort of closer to Jordan, then maybe I'd have all sorts of opportunities come my way. And maybe like lots of people, I just have an emotional attachment to Jordan, and it'd be like really nice to just be validated in that, right? At some point, especially, with father wounds and all these things, right? Like based dad for the internet gets lots of projection onto him. And in some sense, it's like, you can have a really unhealthy expression of that in a world where there's no internet. And maybe the parasocial relationships are made worse here. But I think what secures them is something like the same, which is like how much of your attention goes to loving the people who are close to you and to rectifying those relationships. Like that's what I think about all the time right now is like, is the time that I'm spending thinking about things online or discussing with people online ultimately netting out and me being able to show up in a better way, actually first for me. This is it sounds a little, I don't know.
No, I'm with you.
I come back to this. It's like, in order to love my wife well, I had to like go let myself be the little boy who got sexually abused and love that little boy and like
Loving your neighbor as you love yourself. I think it's inverted actually into where a bunch of people that hate themselves are trying to love their neighbor.
Yeah, you have to. There's a Buddhist. There's a book someone gave me, which was called Elephant Dung, and it was a Buddhist book, and I didn't enjoy it. It mostly just kind of washed past me, and I tried to read it, but I wasn't having a great time with it. But there's this one parable which just hit me so hard, and it was like, I think the story is pretty simple. Like a woman sits down next to a Buddhist monk on a bus, and she asks him, like, what's the most important thing in life? And he says, love the person that you're with. And then he says to her, and remember, the person that you're with more than anyone else in your life is you.
Mm.
So like just this profound realization that like, Jordan Peterson too says, treat yourself as if you're someone you care for. And I watch people struggle with this all the time, right? Like in my own case, right? I said over and over again, hey, yes, I was sexually abused in my teens. I don't think it really did that much to me. I just don't feel particularly bothered by it. I don't feel traumatized. I like whatever. I just kind of got out scot-free. So you can imagine if your child came to you and said that, right? If you're like, okay, you discover that someone's been sexually abusing your child between 12 and 14, and you start talking to your kid and they're like, yeah. I mean, I can see why that's probably not a good thing, but I don't really think it had any effect with it. We'd just be like, yeah, okay, well, he seems cool. Right? Like, no, you'd be like, I need to do, like, we got to do the work here to make, like, that's not, let's take responsibility for what's really happening at the deepest level. And so I didn't hold myself to that standard. I didn't let myself love myself that way. So first it's like, is this loving to myself to engage in the ways that I'm engaging? And then is it loving to my wife? And then is it loving to my children? And then to my friends and family. And it's like, that's actually like, I pray. So that's my, I pray and I read my Bible every day. So I'm a Christian in those ways. And when I first started praying, I sort of engaged in more intercessionary prayer. I thought a lot about people who I loved who were having babies. That was kind of where my mind went, was like, make sure this baby comes here safely and make sure that their marriage is okay and all those things. And then I had this sense that like, God's got a lot on his plate. um, he works in his own ways. I don't really feel like I don't feel like sending messages up to heaven to try to get God to behave in certain ways is particularly effective. So instead I started sort of like redirecting and saying like, how do I show up in a way that's going to help? Right? How, if there's a family of people who are having a child, it's like, how do I be prepared to be the best ally to them? And so the way that I tend to pray today is I'll say the Lord's Prayer and maybe the Peace Prayer. And then I will have gratitude for the beautiful things in my life, right? And then I will think about the most important relationship in my life. And I'll pray on how I can show up in them better. And I'll pray to have, strength and serenity and lovingness and wisdom in those relationships. Think a lot about this idea that I get from C.S. Lewis of the sternness and tenderness of love. And I have the sense that that when we lean towards the tenderness of love, it's very hard to be sufficiently stern. And when we lean towards the sternness of love, it's very hard to maintain our tenderness.
Yeah.
And so I pray to be strong enough to stand in the painful place where I fully accept the demands of those two poles.
I think that's beautiful. I think it's one of the interesting things, kind of like praying for yourself. What is, I come from I feel like the tradition and just this kind of, where, okay, so the example is, sacrifice, and the example is the cross. And so Jesus, and the example is to feed the hungry. And there is like a devotional message within where which I was primarily raised Southern Baptist, but read, like you said, read your Bible and pray. But there seems to have been a message that got into my mind that if you tend to yourself, that is selfish.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, that could be manipulated easily. Even you can even deceive yourself, I think, in that. But I do think that it's important, to, like you said, even that Petersonian frame of treat yourself like a person you care about, so that hopefully that person knows how to care and properly or well. And I love that the idea of tenderness, and it kind of, some of these things keep having this refrain of going back to the prophetic text that you're reading throughout the Old Testament right now, of this, the rational, hyper rational person can read those texts, and there's always the genocide of Canaan and all this kind of stuff. It's always it's always in the air and the water. But I'm kind of, that's like a super high resolution or something, we're getting into the facts or something. But I don't know if you call it low resolution. I don't know if I'm getting this backwards or not, but it's something that I keep hearing when I think about history as time, and thinking about God's relationship to man or to human, is in that time, something like you can almost hear the dad talking to the teenage son, what the hell are you thinking? What the hell are you thinking? I let you drive my car. What the hell are you thinking? I don't know. That's like a low resolution frame for me, but and in that way, it's Dad, I wasn't, honestly, you're right. I wasn't, and but there's times that people, but I wasn't being responsible. I wasn't, with what, with what you've given me, that kind of thing. So I don't know, but that's what kept coming to my mind when you're thinking about these relationships to the self, and in a meta sense, and I guess even to, just circle it back to Peter, Israel is, who wrestles with God, and in that relationship seems to be real on that point. So it's even in our relationship, so being kind to ourselves, I kind of see this and even I've got it kind of blurred out today, but this nodal network of we come, you and I are at our little nodes, and we're coming up into this digital space, and we're kind of connecting in somewhat of a real way. Actually, Jordan Hall had a conversation with a guy named Pavel the other day, and they were talking about that, how this is almost more like the spirit realm. It's almost the digital nature of things is almost more spiritual in the sense of ephemeral.
Yeah. We're not actually talking to each other.
Yeah, that's strange,
Talking to avatars, right?
From the chest up.
We're literally beaming images of light. That is a really interesting point that John Vervaeke makes, which is that when you look at a human being, they do not emanate light; they reflect light. And that's actually a very different experience from looking at somebody on a screen where they're emanating light at you. And it's kind of profound, in a spiritual sense, because what is the sort of the the primary descriptor of spiritual beings in the Bible? It's that
Like
they're
light.
emitting their
Yeah.
glory. When they refer to the glory of God, it's that his light comes forth and shines on you. So we are literally, in some sense, like appearing as spiritual objects for each other in this. And we are offering our spirits up, which is part of what scares me about the internet, is that there's a place in which your spirit can propagate in ways that are very strange, right? Like I have this sense, I've watched this happen many times. It's like, so this is going back to like, you know, a few years ago, really thinking through some of Peterson's models. But if you imagine that the way that we experience other people is that we kind of, as we get to know them, we begin to build an avatar of them. We have a model of your wife, or in John Vervaeke's terms, we internalize and indwell the other. As we've moved into this digital world, we can both internalize and indwell people very deeply who we don't actually have any real connection or relationship with. And we can offer ourselves as that. And then we can have that avatar. It's like, you know, Jordan Peterson's a good example. Jordan Peterson's avatar lives in millions of minds, and it interacts with itself in ways that have nothing to do with his actual day-to-day actions in the world, right? There's a whole mimetic world of Jordan Petersonalia that is reflected back to him anytime that he gets on the internet, right? So like there's this image of Jordan Peterson as the, you know, ultra right-wing, stupid person, smart person, you know, gobbledygook, whatever, who's the worst, you know, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, racist, etc. And Peterson has to have that reflected back at him. Like there's a demon that wears his face, literally, right? Like think about Red Skull as Peterson.
Yeah.
That is reflected back at him all the time. And imagine the psychological problem of facing that image. And there, you know, and I tend to think that ways in which he's been somewhat colonized by it. And I think he's been remarkably virtuous in the face of what he's done. And I think a lot of other people have been colonized much more badly by their online images. But it's a problem that you face when you open yourself up to becoming a spiritual figure in this spiritual realm.
Well, I think that's a great insight in even in like as the idea of coming here to play, like that's like this is serious. This is a serious arena.
It's a dangerous arena in a way that we don't understand, right? Like it's the same way like I did 5.5 grams of psilocybin in September last year. And I'm still dealing with the like existential crisis that caused. I mean, it was beautiful in many ways. It was very healing, but there's certain ways in which I essentially lost my capacity to experience time normally during the experience, which is kind of hellish, right? Like it's quite terrifying. And then in the wake of it, I still have this like there's this little bit of skepticism in some sense about this. It's harder to sort of sink into the momentary time to time. I don't know if you've ever read Kurt Vonnegut has a book about that. What is it called? Warehouse something. I can't remember the name, but essentially it's about somebody who doesn't experience time normally, who bobs in and out at different parts of time in their life. And
I definitely feel that the digital, like I feel like culturally that in many ways a lot of us are slipping through time in ways that we never would have conceived related to the screens and the light and the emanate, like what it's doing to us. I do think that. And it's interesting. I've talked to someone I'm close with that had a similar experience with that with psilocybin, and the interesting thing that I think something like Paul Vanderklay's, everyone's kind of like doing these, and you kind of started with like the hyper embodied retreat. Like that's kind of the node that you are creating. But when the node starts on the internet, like when it starts in the digital space, and I happen to think like culturally, at least for me, is like Jordan Peterson kind of happened on the internet. Like he didn't, I mean, yeah, he was a college professor and he was a psychologist, but like the phenomenon that took place, 7 years ago happened here. And as a result, like we now, are 8 years later, we're having, it's embedded in this conversation pretty deeply, and it's happening in here. And so that's why I think like it's important to consider how to operate in this space in that way, but it's also interesting to think about the low friction, that I'm talking to somebody on the West Coast, and again, even the time shift that we're on different times, like that's happening right now. And one of the things I wanted to touch on is that we're both going to be at ARC in a few weeks, but that's also the piece about you were at Northwest Estuary, and this idea of like, you consume all this information, it needs to go into the world in positive and productive ways, or else you feel like you're going crazy. And part of it for me coming on here is to try to find, all right, if this happened here, this is where I'm actually going to be able to find the conversation, because I can't find it around the water cooler anymore for various reasons, because of some time issues, out of sync, streaming. People don't watch, Thursday must-see TV anymore, or about like Taylor Swift and the Super Bowl are about the only time everybody's eyes are somewhere, and so like now we have this thing, we're able to meet, have some synced up quasi relationality, but then it's important that these things somehow, if we're taking them seriously, turn into something embodied, that aspect of the play. And so I do think that's important. And I see something like, in my opinion, I'll be interested to kind of know what your view on ARC is in general, but I see it as something like, because when I heard Peterson even kind of describe it, he's building this global network, and there, a lot of it was centered around, the political nature of things, but also viewing it as a spiritual thing. And he was like, well, let's collect the people that I've built this network with and get together, and it's easy to look at it as this hyper statist thing, at least in one section of the internet, but really on any fractal level, that's what what Paul's doing. I mean, it's in a certain way, I don't see it that much different. I'm curious your thoughts.
Well, ARC is not Peterson's project alone. It's a project of people who really appreciate aspects of Peterson, who then bring their own agendas to it. And there's a trade-off between how much it reflects Peterson himself and his network, and how much it reflects the agenda of the people who have the organization and the money and all of the things to make it happen. When I look at ARC and the speakers who are currently invited, I think there's large lacunae in lacunae, however it's pronounced.
You're gonna have to help me out, anyways.
Large gaps, let's say, in the sort of like some of the central figures in Peterson's community as it's been for the last 8 years, right? John Vervaeke is not speaking there, right? Eric Weinstein's not there. Brett Weinstein's not there. The intellectual dark web is not really present. The liminal sense-making space is not present as speakers. It is, as far as I can tell, it's primarily a Christian conservative political thing. looking at what's currently happening in it. Maybe it's contra new atheism, maybe it's contra the World Economic Forum, maybe it's contra Deus. But as an expression of the Peterson community, to me, it lacks a lot. And that, I'm a little bit sad about that, honestly, as I prepare to go there, having now, like, I haven't paid that much attention to it. So I've just started looking through what it is and who's available to speak to. Like, I'm excited that Jordan Hall's going to be there. I'm pleased to talk with him, but yeah, there's a lot of pieces of the community that I think are missing. I think, just John Vervaeke is massive, right? I think John and Jonathan, I think, are Peterson's most important peers. And whatever the agenda is that doesn't arrive at John being a speaker there, I'm very skeptical of. So that's my thoughts on ARC.
And I mean, I caught that Vervaeke, he attended one of your retreats, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I'm just, in some ways, I would assume through that y'all have developed something more than just like a professional, but probably something
John
more.
Yeah, for sure.
And so
biased, but yeah, that's my sense.
But also, I mean, I agree. Like, the first video I made about a year ago getting on here was like, what captivated my attention and my curiosity for 7 years was something like the Digital Church of St. Peterson the First, like,
yeah.
included Jonathan and John,
mm-hmm.
and then what Paul kind of allowed, or kind of tended and in a gardening and pastoring way, like just groups of people to get on and talk about all those things.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as far as kind of like the level above that of there's some kind of synthesis there that I think's unique, that is hard to completely pin down. I know you took a stab at it at Northwest Estuary in that statement, and you shared it earlier here. But I mean, I'd be interested if you wanted to give another stab at why, like, those three guys, Jordan, John, and Jonathan, what it is about their friendship and their that you see as unique in our cultural time.
I think John is one of the most important philosophical characters of the current moment, right? And I think that his the last time that John and Jordan spoke, I texted John and asked him, how many people in the world could you have had a conversation at that depth at those about those topics? He said about 5. Right. John, of course, doesn't have the presence that Peterson has, or even Peugeot has, because his message is more highbrow, right? He doesn't have the common touch. He doesn't have either of their ability to bring the message to a layer that communicates to the average person the same degree. And I think to some degree, John wants it that way. I think what Jordan has is he has an extraordinary ability to scale the philosophical to the pragmatic and the daily, and to do it with pathos. If you look at like public speaking or like prominent public intellectuals, Sam Harris is a good example. There's no pathos, right? Or what pathos there is actually sort of I would say it's what's the word? It's I'm trying to find a word here, but the sense is that I have the sense that Sam, like myself, is actually often motivated by anger that is then portrayed as pure rationality. And so there's pathos behind it that's driving it, but that pathos is actually not It's not making itself visible. A somatic therapist of mine told me, I was saying I was experiencing a lot of anger towards Beth at that stage of my journey. And I was like, I know that I can't express this towards her right now, or I'll scare her away. And he said, it depends. It depends. If you come at her with rational anger, it'll scare her away. If you come at her with vulnerable anger and you speak from her heart, it will be your best tool to bring her back.
Wow.
And then he showed me that. And I think that's actually what Peterson does extraordinarily well. He wears the emotions on his sleeve. You can connect to and you can understand where he's coming from if you pay attention. And that actually makes him far more compelling, but it's also in some ways more real. He's more authentic because he's not lying to you. He's not removing his emotion in a way that actually removes your ability to track what's driving his thinking.
You know, what's interesting about that in my conversation with, I hadn't come out as the time of this recording, but Bethel McGrew, I don't know if you've bumped into her online or not, but like
A little bit, kind of bit. Yeah.
She sees him as like a kind of a true humanist, Peterson, like where humanism was in the water of new atheism as this kind of quasi-religious angle on how to move about the world. But Peterson actually embodied a form of humanism, as opposed to kind of what you're talking about is like, I'm not going to wear my humanity. I'm only going to wear my rationality.
Yes.
And so that's really helpful to me thinking about his impact, and it disarmed so many people that were armed. I think it's really good. Keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, so there's a vulnerability to Peterson, especially early on, that made him very authentic and very compelling. And then what I see in Pajot is, it's like Peterson is in some ways a prophetic character. Like that's almost what makes him the most powerful. Is something like, obviously he's a great intellect and he does that, but there's something about the combination that almost creates a sort of prophetic impact. And then of course, John is like the philosopher of the current era. And then Pajot is like the artist in this story, right? And it's because of his artistic vision that he can sort of like break the frame more deeply than I think in some ways anybody else, right? Like it feels like Jonathan is able to step outside of the secular humanist worldview with a unique degree of facility.
Yeah.
Right? John has said that nobody realizes how radical Jonathan really is. That Jonathan's like a church father reborn, right? And so that's why I think that the three of them offer something really compelling. And this may be very hubristic of me, but I actually think that what I offer is sort of the missing leg of that tripod. And it is, and I think of myself as something like the Pied Piper who's trying to get all the spirits in the disembodied realm to re-embody themselves in person, to re-ground it. And I think actually Paul has a big role to play in that too. And I really, it's always been strange to me that it feels like Peterson doesn't treat Paul as seriously as he should, right? I think he should be invited to more of these conversations. But maybe that's part of Paul's role and what he does so well, because it's the humbleness and the quietness of how he builds community that that's missing from the flash of the internet, the online world. And so I think that my attention is at the level of how do we bring this to practice into the body, and I think Paul's attention is how do we bring this into community.
Yeah.
Like not ARC community, like
right.
Cool, every week estuary community. Like I know these people, I know what their BO smells like, I know what they're like on their worst days, right? That kind of community. And
So
that's where it's real.
I spent 10 years in the church camp world as a professional. I did the music 10 years, 8 weeks of summer for 5 years, and then 2 or 3 weeks for another 5 years.
Mhm.
And at these, the one I was involved in, but most kind of campy experiences, there's that the recreation side of like, in a lot of it's like, what is it? Trust false. What's all that called? Like trust games. Those trust building exercises and kind of low ropes, kind of team building, low ropes stuff. And I was talking to my wife, and as I was kind of preparing for our conversation, and I really, there was, one of the guys that worked in the corporate office for this camp that I was a part of, he came from like being in the recreation side. We have a director at every camp that would be a rec person, and he ended up, going into the corporate side. So he always had like a passion for that, for its value in that come together, and for me, I was pretty athletic, but I'm a kind of of small stature, and so I had my limits, but I was quick and fairly strong for my size and whatnot, and could always enjoy sports and those things. But I ended up getting attracted to the flash of music and of kind of the entertainment side of things. And you mentioned like that, the flash of the internet, of the Peterson phenomenon and stuff, but I would watch week after week, and it didn't always work. It wasn't a perfect thing, but this the kid that doesn't, fit in at school, and then all of a sudden you get thrown into this Bible study group with popular and beautiful people, and there's 15 of you guys, and then you go out and you do your team building thing, and it builds throughout the week, and then you're eating together, and then you're singing these songs and having these intense spiritual, emotional, gatherings, and talking about sin and this stuff. And then you go out on the field, and the popular kid is rooting for the non-popular kid. Maybe for the first time, these two people are like caring for one another in some sort of genuine way within the within the coalescence of that week.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you could relate to this and break all that down, a lot. But I'll just go ahead and throw in the plug for this this Midwest Estuary that's coming up this fall. And there's some people trying to get a pre-paintball event put together, because I know he's a fan of yours, is Grim Grizz. He's got his channel. Like, he always has had this kind of, we need to teach our kids how to paintball for the coming dystopian future.
Zombie apocalypse, right?
But it's also in this, I think, rooted in this, like, learn how to use your body and learn how to be on a team. It's all those pieces. But yeah, I definitely think, like, to consider how that might look like if these kind of things continue to happen on a somewhat, regular basis, that bringing that gift of the embodied, that your architecture for that within Evolve, Move, and Play, your program and retreat program and stuff, like, would just be like adding the rec to the church camp type, like thing.
Yeah.
that is so, that can be seen as juvenile, but as we both know, is like actually like an epidemic of our culture. And I know,
We need to play. We need whimsy. We need connection. We need I've said many times that my fantasy is to like get Jordan and John and Jonathan, let's say, out to return to the source, or like we'll just do an event for a few of them and their close associates, right? Chris Mastro Pietro and Greg Hurwitz, etc. And have them take a sauna, make a meal together, wrestle all day, take a big hike down a creek and waterfalls, and bring them back and like sit them down and just have them chat. Right? Like, have them chat after that. Like, because I really do believe that the capacity for rapport, it grows through these things, and the depth of the meaning in a relationship grows through these things. And those are foundational to the ability to actually play the intellectual game well. Right? Like, we can do it. You and I are having a good conversation right now. But there's a way of navigating that becomes opened more and more as we develop a depth of connection. And I think nothing facilitates depth of connection like intense physical play with other people, and shared food and shared music. That's the power, right? It's like you know, I've been thinking about the Eleusinian mysteries recently, right?
Mm.
Like people are going to do psychedelics, but it's like, are they building the gymnasia, right? Like I really think that that what my body was able to do in healing was dependent on its physical strength and faith capacity. It's pistis. And it's like, we need to build that, right? Like, okay, we got to become that type of people who can wrestle with God. You can't do it if you can't wrestle. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I agree. And even you're pointing to a certain point of like physical institution as well. And like, strength of culture, strength of character, strength of relationship. And those are all questions as this, as our, and it's kind of coming down on our time here, but as our culture, we've shifted our gaze towards the meaning crisis in this way as we think about these pieces that have been disintegrated or deconstructed by, atomanized by postmodernism and deconstructed by modernism and deconstructed by postmodernism, and that we do have to like look at them with genuine and authentic curiosities and figure out then how to take part, which, to put the positive frame, is to meet someone to have that conversation with, like we have done today. And then actually we'll meet in a few weeks, which I'm really excited about. And then finding ways for me, I'll just add this in. Like I have, I guess, a project you could say, I'm helping with a little church community that I've had to make the commitment in my mind that this is the rest of my life. And like, we don't like a vow, like a vow to something. And that a part of all these things, like how can I pour all these, again, all the consumption of content is not to win arguments. It's to build the world. It's to cultivate. Yeah. And so that's a way I think that I can help cultivate part of an antidote or, a civium, like all the things to the future and for our kids. And so I hope that I feel like I'm joining you in that process, Rafe. So
sounds good.
I don't know
for an event if you want to really get deep, and the folks who are listening can as well.
Yeah.
We're opening up our retreats right now, so people can go to the website and jump on a call.
Yeah, Evolve Move Play, is that .com?
EvolveMovePlay.com, yeah. And they can find me on Rafe Kelly all over the internet, and Evolve Move Play on Instagram, and there's the spots to find me. What was I going to say?
I'll just end it with, I don't know. Did you have anything you wanted that you were curious about from my end of the woods? I don't know. I'm a pretty unknown entity in some ways, but as we move forward and developing a little bit of relationality here.
It feels like a hard place to start an hour and 40 minutes of the conversation.
Okay, I hear
you. We'll pick that up when we meet in person at ARC.
Now I'm embarrassed, but yeah.
Wait, I'm going to switch to the interviewer right now. But I appreciate you having me on, and it's really interesting to see this conversation develop, around the connections between spirituality, the problem of the postmodern era, right? Like where postmodernism in some sense is also about a specific technological ecology that we lived within, and we're no longer in that technological ecology, and we face a whole new set of problems. And we may be rapidly moving towards a new ecology already. So we may be in the postmodern before we know it. Damn it. It's all happening so fast. But that's, I think I'm about to work. Brain's falling apart here.
That's the work. That's the work.
Yeah.
So cool, man. Well, again, yeah, it was actually, I was trying to still like this, Paul, I'm still trying to like figure out how to do these conversations. Well, that's why it's a craft, right? Conversation craft. So, yeah, man, thanks for meeting me here, and look forward to connecting again here in a few weeks. So Stick around. We'll close this thing out real quick backstage. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.